welcome to LadiesCon 2021. This is a hybrid convention this year, which means that we have an in-person component in Somerville, Massachusetts, and also the online component that you're watching right now. For information about everything LadiesCon, you can go to ladiescon.com to find our guests, our vendors, and our panels, of which this is one. And this one is history and comics, so I will let our panelists introduce themselves.
What's up, LadiesCon? I'm Sierra Barnes, and I'm coming to you from the beautiful city of Arlington, Virginia. But I wish I was in Somerville, Massachusetts, because that's where I've been spending LadiesCon the last, I guess, 3 years. And it's the best. I make a webcomic called Hans Vogel is Dead, which is coming out in book form super soon on the 21st. And I'm super excited to be here and talk about history and comics.
And I'm Meggie Ramm. I guess that's what it says on my Zoom. My pronouns are they, them. I am currently in Michigan, which is one of the few states that isn't on fire or underwater. And I work on a kids comic called The Littlest Dungeon Guard. And I'm also working on another book called Batcat. And then I'm working on a history comic about the Olympics. And we're also here with Ned, but I think he had to take a call.
Yeah, Ned has to take a call, but Ned is, I guess we'll let him properly introduce himself when he gets back. But he's a lot of fun. He does comics about World War I, which rhymes, and T. Lawrence and his bio. Oh, I was just.
We were introing you.
Yeah,
I'm so sorry. It's like, you know when you get an important phone call and it just happens to come right at the absolute worst moment and you have to take it.
Mm-hmm. So Ned, we were saying that you were a World War I spy, and
yes.
That's as far as we got.
Yeah, no, that's pretty accurate. So hello, I'm Ned Barnett. I make comics about heroes, health, and history. My primary area of interest is the First World War, and in particular, one Mr. T. Lawrence, aka Lawrence of Arabia. You can find me on the internet as @the Ned Barnett, just about everywhere. And yeah, sorry for running away.
Not a problem. All right, so why don't we start with just why all of you think comics is a particularly good medium to talk about history with?
Comics are way less boring.
Wow.
As a start with the spicy takes right away.
It's true though. Like if I have to read, and I think this came up last time. If I have to read something historical, like I'll read the book and it'll be fine, but it won't have any cool pictures. I won't get to see like the cool outfits that, you know, are historically accurate, or like any tanks or anything cool like that. Like I would much rather read a comic about history. And also, as a comic educator, if you are like looking to get your students to absorb more material, it's been shown through research that you're like twice as likely to retain the information if it comes in the form of a comic than in an illustrated text or a textbook. So comics are just better. That's my spicy take.
Just say now the historian's perspective.
I mean, I love prose and comics equally, but I will say that comics are much more fun and sexy. And you do get to, like, there's a lot of information that I feel like can be conveyed in images that don't really translate well in words, specifically with regards to engaging people in an emotional level. I think that there are lots of feelings that you get from looking at old photographs or illustrations that you don't get with a description of the same thing. I don't think that somebody describing, for example, the like 1921 Frankenstein movie would have the same effect as watching it, which I only got through 6 minutes of that movie when I was a child because I was so scared. And like, if you had just been like, Sierra, it's a black and white movie about a dead guy who comes back to life, 6-year-old me would have been able to handle it. But it's that emotional, visceral connection that I
Mhm.
think really lets people in on the fun stuff.
Yeah, one of the things I really love about it is being able to make that visceral connection. And like in my own research, because I do a lot of work with archives and using photography to be able to recreate things, recreate places and periods and people, is that you could get a sense of people beyond the textbook. And like you can read really dry, boring texts. You can also read really exciting texts, and but you don't always come away with a sense of who the people are, and not just like the named people. So like you don't necessarily, like, you can come away knowing, say, who T.E. Lawrence is, reading these history books, but you don't get a sense of who the people fighting on the ground were, because in many cases we don't know their names, but we can look at photographs um, and see that. Like, one of my favorite pictures I found in my archival research was of 3 Arab men playing hide and seek, or in Petra. So there's just this like stone, and you just see these 3 guys like all looking around the stone, trying to catch each other. And it's like you just get these moments of fun and playfulness and humanity that is often missing in more academic text, in prose, and it can be difficult to find. And in comics, being able to take these images and recreate them is a really lovely thing.
Right, all really great answers. Thank you. And so let's move on to how you personally got into um, being interested in and working on historical comics.
Okay, Sierra and Ned, you guys have to go first for this one. Because I fell in sideways. My answer is not as good as yours.
Is there a straight way to get into history comics? I just got way too many degrees in history when I was at William and Mary, and was like, I'm going to enter a respectable occupation like diplomacy. And then I didn't do that because one of my professors of my German studies department, thanks Bruce, professor, told me that I would make a cool comic. And then fire alarm is going off in our building. I'm so sorry. He told me I would make a cool comic, and I was like, that's a cool idea, professor, and then sat on it for a year, and then did that, and then went, this is my life now, and now I'm in comics, and I know too much about history to make anything other than history comics, so.
That's how that happened.
Yeah. So for me, my background is not in academic history. I have actually not taken a history class since I was in high school. Yeah, shock, shame. But that's because I have always had more esoteric interests than history, than my school's history department had classes for. So I picked up a book about T.E. Lawrence 10 years ago and read it, then proceeded to sit down and read 7 Pillars of Wisdom, loved it, and or as much as you can love it, because it's a very difficult book, and have been sort of sitting on the idea from that point of doing something artistic related to T.E. Lawrence. And when I got into making comics, it was about, the idea's been kicking in my head for about 5 years, and then I've been actively working on it on and off for the last 2 or 3 to do a comics biography of T.E. Lawrence. And that is my into history comics. And from there, I've also been interested in other tangential stuff, usually 21st or early 20th century, not 21st century, and things like diseases and First World War.
Cool.
Yeah.
I fell into history comics sideways. My partner's family goes to the Olympics every year. Obviously not this year because of COVID, and they brought me along. I'm not a sports person, So I would just go to the Olympics mainly for the food. And I pitched a comic about the Olympic. Oh, come on, the food? Are you kidding? That's like the best reason to travel. But we went to the Olympics and I pitched the idea of a comic about the Olympics, including the history. And it's still ongoing because we were going to go to the original Tokyo Olympics, and then COVID happened, and then this year's Olympics happened, which has made this book twice as long as it needs to be. So now I have a bunch of super fun, kind of useless Olympic facts that I bust out at parties to bore people with, which is, you know, the only the only thing you get to do with your history knowledge other than make comics with it.
That tracks.
So yeah, that's what I'm doing. But I'm also like a very I really like history comics. I just read one about Artemisia, the painter. Oh man, that was so cool. There's like so much really awesome stuff about her. I just really like history comics. I just enjoy them more than other ones. So
All right, so some of what you were saying segues nicely into the next topic, which is research. And so could you give a little bit of information about how you get started researching a topic, and maybe some of the less obvious channels you go through to research what you're writing about?
Ned, don't you have like a specific library that you go to?
I do. I actually have a specific book that I wrote all about doing research for a comic. So my first comic, Dreamers of the Day, is a hybrid history and memoir comic and biography about T.E. Lawrence and about the trip I made in March 2019 to Oxford University to conduct research on Lawrence, including I primarily went to go to an exhibit that was being put on at one of the college libraries at Magdalen College, and from corresponding with the librarian who had helped to organize the event, I found out that the Bodleian Library, which is the central primary university-wide library at Oxford, is actually open for anyone to go in and conduct research. You have to let them know ahead of time that you're arriving so they can pull the materials for you. And you have a small fee, but you can go in and conduct research. So I went and did archival research there, where I pulled not all of, but a lot of the boxes and books, not books, the boxes of papers and ephemera related to T.E. Lawrence, and sat down in a library, spent a week sitting and reading and looking at old photographs and things like medical bills related to his motorcycle accident that he ended up dying from, and wills and coronary reports and other such materials. And that was really cool. My favorite thing to look at was the photographs, as I mentioned earlier, because they provide such a look into lives that don't always get seen. Except for quite literally, you can see them because they're photographs. And I've been planning to make an additional trip back. That's been pushed back due to COVID. But one thing that was actually incredibly beneficial was last summer, the National Archives in the UK opened up some of their archives digitally, including some of Lawrence's, which were related to his time in the RAF. So I was able to download about 600 pages worth of archival materials from the
Just
RAF.
Yeah, just some light reading. I've skimmed through them. They are, a lot of them are handwritten by very busy men with very bad handwriting. So they'll take a little while to parse through. Fortunately, this is just like stuff that I'm going to need for book number 3, not stuff that I need right away, but I have it, and I can sort of now cross off going to the UK National Archives as I need to do, because I have some of the materials already. But yeah, one thing I have learned in doing research is that if you find people who are experts and you ask them for things, nicely. A lot of times they will go, oh, you like this thing too? Yes, please take this. And it's, or this is how you can access this. And it's a really fantastic, helpful way to go about researching and pulling a story together.
That is very true, actually, to piggyback off of that. A lot of research that I do is also involving folklore, which is something that is always fun to do because a lot of times, especially with stories that have a lot of different versions of them, some of these versions get lost to time, and specifically lost to the mouse who creates versions of them that then subsume every other version of them. So sighs deeply in German. But like even things as weird as, and we're going from Oxford to like the complete opposite end of the spectrum, Twitter. There is a thriving community of folklorists on Twitter who are doing this out of the goodness of their hearts and a thriving obsession with region-specific folklore. And I was fortunate enough to run into a Jürgen Hubert who collects German folklore across various times and regions of Germany, and translates them and compiles them into books. And he is a fabulous resource that I have definitely, I interacted with him on Twitter and sent him a note just saying, hey, I'm making a comic. I'm looking for German folklore. Can you help me out? And he went just absolutely bananas, just dumping folklore, random stories in my inbox around anything from goats to a specific region of the Alps to mentions of a very specific monster that hops on people's backs and rides them around. And it's, people are very passionate about things, and asking people about what they're passionate about is something that I find rewarding for everyone involved. And you know, you would be surprised at what you find.
Yeah. Well, going back to Twitter, that's actually how I found out about the Lawrence event. Is I just happened to follow, like, it just happened to show up on my feed, and one day in 2018, and actually I think I found out about it. I was in the UK when it opened, and I found out about it like the day I got back, sort of thing. So I was like, oh, I need to go to this. So I planned another trip. But yeah, but it's like, that's how you can find your communities. There's a really, really fantastic community of academics who are interested in the First World War, and like talking about things from like women and war and medicine and war to one of my favorite people on Twitter is a First World War historian named Chris Kemschel, and he is researching video games in the First World War and Star Wars and the First World War. And he's writing a history, a military history of the Star Wars universe. I love it. He's so cool. And it's just like the coolest person.
Yeah. Tetris by Box Brown is a historical comic about the beginning of video games. And who gives a flying rat's patoot about, we're keeping it PG, who gives a flying rat's patoot about Tetris? I mean, you can download it for free on your phone. I'm sorry, Sierra, I just fighting words, but like, because of that comic, I was like very invested in Tetris and also Pong. So
it's like, such a cool comic.
I'm uninviting you from all of our future panels, Meg.
Oh, that's fine. Or wait, no, that's not fine. Don't uninvite me.
Gone. Get out.
Sorry. We were all joking about how before this panel started that we're all sharing one brain cell, and my apparently my turn is up.
We're all sharing half a brain cell.
Half a brain cell. But I in terms of my research, I'm kind of lucky because there've been really good records of Olympic sports and who's won the most medals and ran the fastest and jumped the highest or whatever by the IOC. It is a little frustrating because it is very America-centric. They're really good at keeping track of, the major superpowers and not as much of, not America. But my favorite thing to do is try and find really old books that are printed about the Olympics, because they'll usually have some stories that maybe aren't on the Olympic.org like website or through their research. Ned, like what you were saying, how you really like finding photographs. I have just like this one, like the Olympics Through the Ages book that came out like in the 60s. And it's got like a very, very, very skewed view of the Olympics, but it's really good finding research like that, because then you can also see how people in the 60s view the Olympics versus now. Because the people in the 60s were like, ah, yes, this paradigm of excellence, sports and man, like what two things could go together better? And now people are like, the Olympics, oh, for the love of God, are we still talking about that? So I think finding like older, I mean, you guys are going like way, way, way in the way back. I'm going like into the earlier like 1900s to find my.
We're going just over 100 years. Like it's
Yeah.
not, I mean, I'm going just over 100 years. And
Yeah.
like it's not like we're Paleolithic
Yeah.
creators, like who I love Paleolithic comics. Like it's so cool, like the research that people like Otava Helika and Ray Bear are doing into these topics that don't have written documentation. I think it's all based off of archaeology and like the artifacts that are left behind, and it's cool. I'm in awe of people who do that.
I couldn't do that research. I need something where I can see a photo.
Yeah. I'm like late, like Victorian era and forward. And we'll stop like interwar period.
There's just like, I just love my folklore so much.
I mean, it's not even the folklore elements. Like if you study Eastern European history, you're like, nothing is real. The documents aren't real. The photographs aren't real. None of it's real. It's all been doctored. Or it's not.
I mean, it has
anymore.
I think
whatever. Like somebody making a comic about the people who made the cave paintings, and somebody making a comic about the early like Soviet party. Not knowing who was there, what was happening, who died.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like sources are.
What are sources?
Yeah, what are sources? You gotta be careful about your sources, and sometimes your sources just. Anyone's game.
I mean, like I'm one of the frustrating things from my own research is the only person to write a history, like who was on the ground to write a history of the Arab Revolt, was T.E. Lawrence.
That's fine. You just need that one person, and just coincidentally, it's the person that you're also researching.
Well, yes, exactly. I mean, and by and large, it's all from an English perspective, and so therefore it's from rather a colonialist and what's the word I'm looking for? It's from a very biased perspective. One thing that has been really cool though is battlefield archaeology, is that there are people who actually go out and have managed to confirm a lot of the things in Seven Pillars of Wisdom that other people were like, I don't think it sounds like you're telling the truth. Like they've gone out and they've been like, no, this is the location. Like this is like what we found, like archaeologically, what we found in terms of artifacts and bullet casings and blown up train tracks. Like, no, this is actually really accurate, which is really cool. But at the same time, like you're getting potentially the accuracy of what happened on the ground, but it's filtered through someone else's perspective.
Yeah.
For at least me, which is fortunate, is that I'm writing it about his perspective. And I can just be very much like, he's a biased, unreliable narrator, and we are leaning into it.
Research.
Woo.
Yay.
So that is another good segue, because one of the things that I find interesting about writing about history is how you approach filling in the gaps, whether they're the big ones where like no one knows for certain what happened, or just small things like a biography of Charles Schultz I was reading once. It said Schultz was on the train and he was thinking this, and I'm reading it thinking, how do you know that? So like what What is your personal approaches to interpretation and kind of trying to figure out the stuff that's not necessarily in the historical record, even if you are digging deeper than just the textbooks?
I feel like you kind of figure that, or you like fill in those spaces with like the narrative, because at the end of the day, you're trying to make a comic or a story that has a beginning, middle, and an ending. And so you're trying to make some kind of overarching narrative. And so even if like it doesn't happen where there's like, you introduce the character, there's a conflict, there's a solution, you have to find some way to kind of tie those together. So like, even if Charles Schultz wasn't on the train, you know, you're going to have that happen. And also like, no matter what we do, because we're cartoonists, we're taking information that we've researched or discovered, and we are reinterpreting it, like no matter what. Like my drawings of the Olympics are not going to be like historically accurate, taken perfectly, looking exactly how it happened, when it happened. We're going to do our best, but we're not going to be able to get like 100,000% historical accuracy. So I think when you're trying to fill in those gaps, it's kind of just what you're doing as a cartoonist. You're just trying to take something where you have the building blocks and make it into a story. But especially, and I think I've talked with Sierra about this at some point, like you do enough research so that way when you're drawing Charles Schultz, for example, on a train, you're making sure that that train looks like one that Charles Schultz would have ridden. So if you get enough information and enough like drawing research, reference photos that you can kind of fill in those gaps, even if it isn't like 110% accurate, you're trying to put your reader into that space, into that time as much as possible.
I try and shy away from the term accurate, actually. Like,
that's a good point.
as I've like, one of the concepts that we talk a lot about in German studies is like, what is history at all? German studies, and it talks about history a lot for some reason, no idea why. But there's, I do know why, that was sarcasm. The German word for history is Geschichte, which just translates out to story. It's the same word. And that's something that I'm like kind of high-key obsessed about. And I do think that there is a bit of a misnomer with the whole idea of history as nonfiction, because accuracy, what does that even mean? Like, if something literally happened, sure, it literally happened, but when you're going through the lens of portraying it, when you're going through the lens of telling someone else about it, when you're going through the lens of retelling it to someone who wasn't there, which a lot of the history that we're doing involves, it is going to be through a lens that might, you know, like if I tell somebody that in 1914 World War I started, and I tell somebody else that, or I guess tell the same person that Daenerys Targaryen was born in whenever, to them functionally, like, these are two pieces of information, one is true, one is false, but functionally to them, it's more or less the same as far as like inputting information. And I think that's one reason why like people who make history have to be really careful about things like accuracy and like making sure not to be too caught up in the idea of being this like perfect preserver of an absolute truth, because that absolute truth doesn't necessarily exist. Like one person can live their entire life and you can record every single detail about their life, but that experience, even though it is true for that one person, will not hold over to another person. There's a film that I love called Europa, which is about a World War II story about a Jewish kid who goes on just the most, it's based on a true story, and this kid gets, like, his parents are separated, leaving for Poland for one of the camps, and he's separated, and he just goes through a series of these really bizarre adventures just trying to survive. And one of them, he's trying to pretend to be an Aryan kid and he goes to Hitler youth camp, and one of them he pretends like he's a Soviet like soldier and he's an interpreter, and he eventually makes his way to Israel. But it's like, just because that story is true for this one individual, that doesn't mean that a bunch of other people didn't die, or a bunch of other people didn't, you know, live in hiding, or a bunch of other people. Like, all of these experiences are in a way specific, and the more macro you get about history, the less accurate it is. So telling a story about like the life of T.E. Lawrence, you can be like, okay, this is granular. And like telling something about Charles Schulz on the train, you can be like, okay, so I know that Charles Schulz wrote about this particular thing. So, and he was on a train on these dates. So I could reasonably say that he was thinking about this issue that he had written about on the train. Whereas when you're writing about something about the Olympics and you're like, oh yes, Michael Phelps was worrying about this before he took off, like,
oh, he's not even
that's one
show
thing,
up
but
in my book.
spicy Michael Phelps.
Spicy
If you're gonna be like, Olympic swimmers worry about this, even, it's like, well, that's not gonna be true for every Olympic swimmer.
Yeah,
That's not gonna even be true possibly of a majority of Olympic swimmers. Like, at some point you just got to accept that some of it's gonna be a little made up, and you're gonna try and make it as informed as you can.
yeah.
And that's sort of the thing, is that you, as the writer, this is something that's taken me a while to sort of accept, is that everything that you do, there's a form of fiction to it. Like, especially like in comics, because we have to distill something down even further than if you're writing a book. Like, I'm looking at my bookshelf, and there's a 1,000-page biography of T.E. Lawrence on my bookshelf, and I know that writer had to cut things out, and I'm hoping to consult his archives too, because they're now at Magdalen College. And with the comic, oh God, there's so much I'm gonna have to cut out. There's like, and I'm planning to, my goal is to do it in 3 volumes, to focus each volume focusing on a different period of his life, so that I don't have to do a like overarching from birth to death. I can do a overarching from birth to First World War, and then First World War to like leaving public life, to time in as an enlisted man to death. Like, can chop it up, but it's, yeah, there's so much that you have to streamline and you have to cut out, and you really just have to go like, I'm not writing an academic textbook. And that, I think, is something that can be really difficult for academics who pick up history comics to understand, is that we're not going through every single little detail. This is more of a popular history, and we have a story, we have the storyline that we're trying to follow. Sometimes we need to dig a little bit to find those connecting dots, and find it and pull it together.
Yeah. There was that one cartoonist who did an illustrated version of the Apple user terms and agreements. And you could do, like, we could do something like that for each of our subjects, which would be including all of that information, but there isn't a story there. There isn't. I mean,
no. Textbooks don't even do that. Like,
yeah.
Academic textbooks have a narrative. They take things out. Like, the original sources have a narrative and leave things out. Like, everyone does it. It's just, you can't possibly address every aspect of everything all the time.
And that's something that I think it's very good that we're acknowledging it, and it needs to be acknowledged more. And also, I like, the whole accuracy thing. I was chatting with a friend of mine who was like, do you think it's okay if I like use costuming that's a couple years older than the period that I want it to take place in, like only off by like 5 years, sort of thing, because I like drawing that more. And it's like, how, like, no one's gonna care. Like, you'll get a couple pedants who are just like, this is from this period, this is from 10 years prior, and like, and you're studying it in this era, so you can like, and you can do this, and it's like, no one's gonna care. Like, people rewear clothes.
The shirt's probably at least 5 years old, so
fashion is not as hard line. Like, I love the fashion question because it's never as hard line. And like, when I was working on Hans Vogel, like, it takes place in 1941 during World War II, and he's a member of the Luftwaffe. And so everyone, me, an idiot, was like, oh, this is going to be great. It's a uniform. There's lots of references out there. And then I realized that the Luftwaffe was a huge mess and was completely unorganized, and people were wearing all kinds of weird shit and stuff. And like, anyone out there who's like going to judge me on whether or not the buttons are correct for his rank and file, one, you're wrong, because it was a mess. And two, I drew all the swastikas backwards on the plane, so you have something else to look at. So if people are going to complain about the stupid uniform stuff, there's probably something else further along down the comic that you've done something worse at. So pick your battles.
I love that for my own shit, is that excuse me, for my own stuff, Lawrence did not care about his uniform at all. And like there are notes on like how like he didn't feel like wearing the brass buttons, so he put leather buttons on instead, and everyone just sort of accepted that this like short little troublemaker was just not going to wear his uniform correctly. And he was my height. He was like 5'5", and at one point during the war weighed 90 pounds. So this like little tiny dude, this was when he came back from his time in the desert. And so none of his uniforms fit him. So I'm like, great, I don't actually have to draw a correct uniform when I draw him. It's like, I know he doesn't have the Tom Brown belt most of the time. I know his buttons aren't going to be right. I know he forgot his hat half the time. Like, doesn't matter. Nothing matters.
Yeah.
Nothing matters. Do your best.
Yeah, do your homework, do your best.
There's always going to be somebody who also is like a history nut on whatever subject you're learning, who's going to want to call you out on stuff, not because it matters that you did something wrong, but because they want to say that they have more information than you, and that's fine, because then you get to nerd out with them about history.
Yeah,
exactly.
There are more people who are interested in the same thing you are and want to be friends with you because you made a comic about the thing that they're very interested in. So don't be afraid of people calling you out for stupid stuff in your comic. Just make your comic. You're doing great, sweetie.
Yeah.
So since we are getting towards the end of our time, I want to make sure we talk about your individual projects, past, present, and where it's possible future. And specifically, I was wondering if there's been a place where you've come across some information in your research and thought, I am so glad I get to convey this in comics, or that you were really excited for the challenge or the opportunity to put it across in a really unique way that only comics could do.
So I'll go first because mine is very easy to do. So my past work and hopefully future work is about T.E. Lawrence, and I'm just really excited to be able to delve into this really fascinating historical figure who is misunderstood, because the most well-known piece of information about him is David Lean's movie Lawrence of Arabia, which is a great movie, but it is not a very excellent portrayal of the Lawrence that I've found in the reading that I've done. For current projects, I am redacted, but know that when I'm no longer redacted, that I'm really excited to be able to bring these stories to life. And hopefully I'll be able to talk about them soon. But
Sierra, do you want to go next? I'm still thinking.
Oh, okay, I'll go. My current project / future project / forever project is Hans Vogel. The first volume comes up on the 21st through Kickstarter, through Cast Iron Books. I'm very excited. And I sort of always knew that it was going to be a comic for a few reasons, not the least of which being I can have all of the World War II dogfights I want in comics, and it doesn't cost me anything except my wrist. One of the big advantages of comics is I can make anything happen on the page, and I really wanted to have some juicy Battle of Britain dogfights. And while I cried every day drawing the planes, I made some juicy World War II dogfights, and that in itself is fun. But also what I could do is have angry Valkyries tell a Nazi that he did a bad job, which is another great thing that I can do in comics that I probably couldn't do in another genre. Definitely not as emotionally satisfying. I mean, I love comics. I think they're weird and wacky. I wouldn't work in any other medium. It's this Hans Vogel is dead. Read it online.
Kickstarter coming to a computer near you. My name's Sarah Barnes. It's
Right.
Hans Vogel's dead. Please come.
Yeah, please come right
Buy
now.
my book,
It's out.
please.
Volume 1 just started. Volume 2 just started.
So I'm doing a couple different projects. I'm doing a kid's book called Bat Cat. It's about a non-binary bat that's also a cat, hence the name Bat Cat. And I'm really enjoying that because it's just very silly. But to the question that you asked, what am I really excited about in terms of like the research that I've done about the Olympics? I'm really excited to call the Olympics out on their bullshit. Because especially this year, their gender policies for trans and intersex athletes have been really crappy, along with how they treat minority athletes. And I'm just really excited that I have a chance to like have a book and really dive into the history of the Olympics and how it's always just kind of been about white dudes and how they need to get their act together. And I'm just really grateful that I get to just have a whole comic book where I can rip the International Olympic Committee a new one. That's what I'm really looking forward to.
Are you going to include the marijuana controversy?
Yeah, and that's the other thing is I had so much, I mean, we were talking about this, I had so much research from like the last time we did this, and then the book got delayed because of COVID. And now with this past Olympics, like there's the marijuana controversy, there's Caster Semenya, which is a whole other thing. There's a bunch of other intersex athletes that were banned from the Olympics for a bunch of other reasons. So I don't know. I'm excited to tell some of the stories other than the like, oh yay, America won the most medals again.
And like all the Middle Eastern, was it judo competitors who were all dropping out? So there was the
so sorry, this is my
sorry, I'm not
oh no.
I'm asking.
No,
this is your thing. It's like
so there's this thing that the IOC used to have called Rule 50, which made it illegal for any Olympian to protest while on the medal stand. But the thing with Rule 50 is it is specifically designed to kind of like tamper down the Black Lives Matter movement, because it's just like, yeah, so when you're on the podium, like you can't do anything like with your fist, or you can't like kneel, like that's not cool. And it's like, okay, so those two things, those are the two things you can't do. But like this year, it used to be that if you did any sort of protest on a stand, you would get banned. And a couple of Olympians during their trials ended up getting like kicked out of the team for doing it. But then people got to the Olympics and they're like, Rule 50? What Rule 50? And it was just like protest left and right. And I was here for it. So that's another thing that I'm really excited to talk about.
I'm so excited for your book, because this is going to be, it's doubling the amount of work that you have to do, which is not exciting.
Well,
but
no, it's
you're going to be able
to be fun.
You're going to bring in such a unique and interesting perspective, because it really changes how people think about the Olympics. And
it's a sports book for and by somebody who knows literally nothing about sports. It's just going to be about the culture and like the history. Like, don't ask me who won anything this year.
That's what's interesting.
Sports is history. It's all history. History,
cultural history
happening.
Yeah, that's the exciting thing. Like, I don't.
What do we don't know, but it's not so much who won, it's what are we talking about years later? What is the story? What's the cultural change? What's the shift?
Yeah.
And that's
perfectly said.
Who won may surprise you.
But we don't actually care about that. We care about the we care about the cultural shifts brought about by the different parts of the Olympics. You could do a whole book just about protest in the Olympics. That would be fascinating.
Oh my gosh, I could.
That's the follow-up.
Yeah.
Stay tuned for more.
Well, my goal is I'm just gonna try and pull in like all of the like really sports obsessed bros, because it's gonna be like, oh, a comic about the Olympics, how exciting. And then I'm gonna change their minds. That's my plan.